Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins.
Hello, and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Joy Dobbins. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist. And on the show, we delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition. And today's episode is all about brain health, concussions, traumatic brain injury, and omega-3 fatty acids. My guest today is Dr. Michael Lewis. He's the founder of the Brain Health Education and Research Institute and the author of When Brains Collide. Welcome to the show, Dr. Lewis.
It's great to be with you.
I am really looking forward to talking with you about this important topic, and I'd love for you to share some information about your background. You have quite a resume, and I'd love for you to just share with our listeners some of that and what led you to studying brain health and some of the information about omega-3s and how that ties in. And then I've got some questions for you.
Okay. The short of the story is I am a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And I played Army for a couple of years before I went to Tulane Medical School and had every intention of being a surgeon and was going down that path. And I ended up actually deciding to go to the other extreme and became board certified in preventive medicine and public health. And a part of that through the Army got me really involved in infectious diseases and eventually back to the military's medical school in Bethesda. And now there's, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan going on, and there's wounded warriors, and you wonder what you can do to have a more immediate impact to help with our soldiers recovering from injuries. And so I kind of put two and two together and came up with an odd number and went to the head of research at Walter Reed and asked, is anybody looking at the use of omega-3s, like from fish oil, to help our soldiers recover from traumatic brain injury? The answer was, no, why don't you? And I suddenly found myself thrown in the deep end of the swimming pool, trying to learn as much as I could, as fast as I could, because that was definitely not something that was being taught in medical school. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that really, there was nobody out there that was talking about it at the time. And there was very few people I could network with to learn from. And, the idea of using omega-3s for traumatic brain injury and concussions and neurology is just not something that was being discussed. Omega-3s are used for heart health and started to gain some traction in mental health, but nobody was talking about physical injury to the brain. So that was a career changer, and I headed down that road for a while and eventually retired from the military after 31 years altogether and got a small private practice where I focused on those types of patients, people struggling to recover from concussions, started a small nonprofit, and do a lot of speaking and education and always trying to either coordinate, foster, or influence research.
Excellent. You mentioned heart health. We've known for a long time that omega-3s are important for heart health, and we're hearing a lot now about brain health. You mentioned mental health, and we're going to talk about concussions and brain injuries. How much of our brain is made up of fat, and is that where that begs the question, if the brain is made up of fat, we need to look at fats and omega-3s?
Well, the brain is principally made of fat, in particular, three main types of fats, cholesterol, omega-6 type of fats, and omega-3 types of fats. And so actually about 30% of the weight of the brain, the dry weight minus the water, right? So about 30% of the brain is these omega-3 type of fats. And you can't have a conversation about omega-3 fats without having including omega-6 type of fats, because they're meant to be in balance. And omega-6s and omega-3s are literally help form the structure of the cell membrane in the brain, really every cell, but most concentrated in the brain. And the downstream effects when omega-6s and omega-3s are released from sort of their structural function are meant to be in balance and work with each other. And omega-6s, the downstream effect is to promote inflammation, and omega-3s are meant to resolve the inflammation. So inflammation is life. You need it. It's part of every day, every second, as far as life, because when you have some kind of an injury, even at the most microscopic level, you need inflammation to start that repair process. But we have to resolve that inflammation. And the problem is in today's society, today's American culture and how we eat is we're way out of balance on omega-6s. And so in some cases, in a lot of cases, on average, 20, even 30 to 1 out of balance between the omega-6s and the pro-resolving omega-3s.
Right. And so omega-6s in the diet is from sources such as polyunsaturated fats.
Well, both are actually, omega-3s and 6s are polyunsaturated fats. And for a while, we didn't really understand necessarily the differences between them. I'm talking 20, 30, 40 years ago. And we thought, well, all polyunsaturated fats are good. They're good for your heart. They're good for a variety of things. But we didn't really appreciate years ago the difference between omega-6 fats and the omega-3 fats. And so in some ways, it got out of control because we just said, okay, polyunsaturated fats are good, and we didn't distinguish between omega-6s and omega-3s.
And obviously versus saturated fats, we want to limit those. And we kind of said, okay, let's, all these polyunsaturated fats are good. And then we started looking at 6s versus 3s. And you mentioned balance. And we know with diet sometimes it's not necessarily that, certainly we get a plentiful supply of omega-6s in the diet, but not necessarily too much, quote unquote, as long as we're getting enough omega-3s. Is that right? Like you said, the balance?
Well, it is about balance. And the problem, there's a couple of issues with how we look at this balance. Omega-6s are ubiquitous. They're throughout the food supply. It's what we use to process food. You find it in junk food and processed foods and oils, vegetable oils is actually one of the bigger sources. But the bigger thing is when you look at the structure of omega-6s and omega-3s, omega-6s are actually very stable and stiffer as a molecule, but they're very stable, and that's why we use omega-6s to process food, whereas omega-3s are very flexible and they're very unstable. And, so if you take, a box of crackers, for example, and you put it out in the sun for 3 days, the crackers may be stale, but they're not going to spoil. Mm-hmm. Whereas you put, a piece of fish out in the sun for an hour and it's going to go rancid. Mm-hmm. And that just kind of gives you an idea of the stability of omega-6s versus 3s. So if you're a food processor and you want to ship your food around the world, you're going to use omega-6s to process the food. It only makes sense.
Right. And you mentioned inflammation, which is also very much in the news these days. And I appreciate your point about inflammation's good. We need it, but then we need to resolve it. And again, having that in balance, it reminds me of blood clotting. Like we want the blood to clot, but not too much and not too little.
Well, interestingly enough, omega-6s and omega-3s, another downstream effect is actually on blood clotting. So omega-6s promote blood clotting, and omega-3s keep the blood from clotting. So it really is, again, all about balance.
Right. And you mentioned fish. We know that seafood is an excellent source of omega-3s, and we're going to talk about diet and supplements a little bit later. But let's talk more about the actual brain health and concussions and traumatic brain injury, since that's your area of expertise. And, again, prevention, we'll weave that in as well because it goes hand in hand. So let's talk about, what is a concussion and what causes it?
Well, if you think about winter's coming, right? So if you think about slipping on the ice and your feet go flying, your head hits the pavement, well, your skull comes to a sudden stop, but inside your skull, your brain is bathed in fluid to help try to protect it, but such a large blow to the head like that, the brain keeps moving and is going to hit the inside of the skull, and it may even reverberate. And that is going to lead potentially to basically a contusion, or maybe if it's even worse, it could rupture blood vessels and cause bleeding inside the skull. But that contusion, that bruising of the brain, that's just the beginning. I mean, you may see stars, you might lose consciousness, although that's actually relatively rare. You may have some memory issues around it, and everybody thinks, okay, well, you sort of shake that off. I'm okay, I'm a little bit woozy or dizzy or whatever, but I'll shake that off. And everybody's like, well, that's a concussion. Well, the problem is that's just the primary part, or the beginning, because what that does is that sets off these biochemical cascades. And, the most potentially devastating one or interesting one is inflammation. So that's actually what we call the secondary injury. And those biochemical cascades can lead to further cell death over minutes, hours, weeks, months, years, even decades. When we look at chronic inflammation, for example. And the best example I can think of, really, that everybody can just picture is Muhammad Ali taking some punches as a young man, and how he was later in life with Parkinson's and, eventually died from that. Well, they're absolutely related in that you've got these contusions from boxing, and those neuroinflammatory cascades were just never really brought under control. So that just sort of kind of burns and churns through the brain, causing more and more damage over time.
Wow. Yeah, it's a long-term condition and process. I actually have a family member who shall remain nameless, who unfortunately got out of hockey to go to volleyball to have a safer sport. And in the first game, conked heads with somebody else and has had long-term concussion. I don't know the actual diagnosis, but he's had long-term issues. And more than 4.8 million people in the U.S. visit the emergency room every year to be evaluated for concussions and brain injury. And we were talking before the interview, my son, who's 11, last year in basketball, he ran into another kid during a game and broke his nose, and we took him to the ER, and they said, well, you probably have a slight concussion too, and didn't really do anything about it. But we all are at risk at some point for falling, hitting our head, that sort of a thing.
Well, we really are. And everybody wants to, the spotlight has certainly been on the NFL the last 10 years or so. But you're right. I mean, kids should be out playing sports, and they should be doing that on a frequent basis, if not a daily basis. And so the two biggest groups at risk would be our youth, and our older population, actually, because sort of similar reasons. One is kids are just growing into their neuromuscular control, right? You think about an infant, for example, and their head is much larger in comparison to their body than an adult. And so they haven't developed that neuromuscular control and that neck strength. So kids from infants certainly are trying to learn how to walk, and they're falling, but then you got kids on the playground and on skateboards and the monkey bars and bicycles. There's a lot of bicycle accidents and skateboard accidents, even deaths on a yearly basis, much more than, say, organized sports. And kids are daredevils. They're supposed to be out there trying, they're invincible, and that puts them at risk. On the other extreme, our much older population are losing their neuromuscular control and their muscle mass and their ability to stay up. You think about what's the mortality rate of a broken hip from a fall in an older person, and it's not good. So our very young and our very old are at risk, but so is everybody else, because you go out to get your newspaper on an icy morning and you slip. Driving, think of how many millions and millions of miles are being driven in cars every single day, and that puts you at risk as well.
Every day. I mean, it happens all the time.
It does, but you got to live life.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about when you first started being more aware that omega-3 fatty acids and fish oil could be effective in treating concussions and even more serious brain injuries.
The one incident that really kind of brought things to light for me was in January 2006, the Sago mine accident, coal mine accident in West Virginia. And there was the one miner that had survived out of 22 or 23 guys on, a mile underground. And it was methane gas and carbon monoxide poisoning, basically, that killed everybody. And when they got down there, I think about 41 hours after the accident, there was just one guy inches away from death, but he was the only one still alive, a guy named Randy McCloy. And they did everything they could that you would do for carbon monoxide poisoning, hyperbaric oxygen, and his organs had shut down, so they had to do dialysis and, everything medically possible to keep this guy alive. But they were still left with a young man who didn't basically have any brain activity. So he was essentially pretty close, if not, what you would almost consider brain dead. And out of desperation, they started pouring really big doses of fish oil down his feeding tube. And the short of the story is he walked out of the hospital a couple of months later. And has gone on to lead a relatively normal life, and has had several children, married and several children. And I looked at it and I said, well, if it worked for something like that, carbon monoxide poisoning, and here we are at war, and you've got soldiers coming back to Walter Reed from Iraq and Afghanistan, and that was what prompted that question, is if it worked for that, omega-3s might work for traumatic brain injury. And the answer was nobody was really looking. Nobody had looked at it. And so that kind of just started me down that road, both research-wise but also clinical experience-wise.
Tell me about some of the research and some of the cases and what you've seen and where you are in that journey now. Where are you headed? Well,
the biggest one was there was a kid named Bobby who was in a terrible car accident, 18-year-old high school senior, goofing around on a Saturday night while his parents were out of town, and takes the family car and speeding around on windy country roads and loses control, and obviously a terrible accident. And so he was essentially, when the parents were called and got to the hospital, they just said, there's no chance this kid is going to survive. You just pull the plug. There's zero chance this kid is going to even make it through the weekend. And somehow, I know how, but the parents have got in touch with me through some mutual friends. And I talked to the neurosurgeon and said, well, you got nothing to lose. Why don't we try what they did for the Sago mine accident minor? Why don't we try that with this kid? And, we got nothing to lose, see what happens. And so the neurosurgeon agreed, and she started to pour high doses of omega-3 fish oil down his feeding tube. And Bobby went to his high school graduation 3 months later.
Wow.
And so it's pretty miraculous recovery. And we published that as a case report in the scientific literature, and it got picked up by Sanjay Gupta and CNN, and Sanjay Gupta did a nice 8-minute segment on one of his weekend shows, and that really kind of started the ball rolling with a lot of this.
That's fascinating, and such a great story. And how long ago was that?
That was March of 2010.
Okay. Do you feel like the word has gotten out that this is a treatment option? Where are things with the medical community?
Well, it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. The medical community is sometimes a little stuck in their ways, and sometimes they're progressive, and it just depends. So I'll give an example. The neurosurgeons on the battlefield of Iraq and Afghanistan at the combat surgical hospitals, they weren't asking for permission to do a double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical trial when they said, we got to save this kid's life, and they pull the part of the skull off and allow the brain to swell without being in that compressed compartment of the skull. And it turned, that's now almost standard of care when there's a huge amount of swelling and a severe traumatic brain injury. The problem was, once you get through that acute phase, you save the kid's life, the very acute phase, and it sort of turns into more of the medical phase. There really was nothing and has been nothing out there to help with the recovery. And that hasn't changed a lot from that aspect, even though there are guidelines out there that say you should use immune-enhancing feeding formulas, including omega-3s. It's more expensive. And so hospitals are always trying to, save money or cut corners and whatever. So it's really not become the standard of care that it should. But in other instances, we've had great success. We took a big blow in sort of this area when the NCAA came out about 3 years ago and said, we are not going to allow universities to provide their athletes with fish oil, where it's a not permissible substance, meaning not that it's banned, but you're not allowed to provide it to your athletes on the training table, as an example. And so there was some pushback against that. And fortunately, earlier this year, in early 2019, they kind of reversed that and said, okay, omega-3s, fish oil can be on the training tables. And they even went further and saying that we recognize that omega-3s are important for brain development and brain health and mental health. And so, it sort of was 2 steps backwards and 3 or 4 steps forward, a year or two later, to where now the training tables for athletes at the university level allow for protein supplementation and fish oil and omega-3 supplementation, which is a huge, great step forward.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful news. I remember hearing about that a little bit, and it begs the question, obviously, if we know that omega-3s are important for brain health in prenatal, infants, childhood, and even as older adults, cognition, even eye health. And then when you have a concussion or a brain injury, you're seeing this treatment improve the outcomes. It would make sense that if you have a good omega-3 status before you have an injury, that would be a good preventive or maybe lessen the severity of the injury. Is that the case?
It is. And interestingly enough, how a lot of my thought processes came about from the Sago mine accident and looking at the situation and asking questions and trying to figure it out. One of the first things I thought of was, how soon after an accident can we get omega-3s on board? And how can we do it the fastest way? So I actually started looking into and eventually patented a formulation for an IV, so intravenously, right? Just kind of mainline it. And it's still not in a commercially available product, but the idea in my mind was a battlefield medic or an EMT in the back of an ambulance. Once you have IV access, can you just push a bunch of omega-3s into the bloodstream to start getting that balance back and help kind of dampen, but not eliminate, but kind of right-size that inflammation? And as I was pursuing that and looking how to get that developed, an interesting question came up is, well, if I'm looking how soon after an accident, what about before the accident? So there's actually been a couple of studies, a lot of preclinical studies, but there was one great study done in 2014 at Texas Christian University using their football team. And they basically put their football team on a variety of different doses of omega-3s, everything from 0 or placebo to a couple grams of fish oil on a daily basis. And they showed a couple of things. One was following a blood biomarker that normally goes up over the course of a season. It's very closely correlated with number of head injury, or not injuries, but head impacts, helmet to helmet type of thing. So football players over the course of the season, this marker would go up. And what they found was the omega-3s kept it flat. That marker didn't ever rise above what the non-starters, or even I think they compared it against the swim team or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so there was no difference. It kept those markers of inflammation from rising over the course of a football season. So great study, and what's not published in that is they saw half the number of concussions that they historically would see on a regular basis as well.
Mm-hmm, right, and all of those small, quote-unquote, impacts can add up. Obviously, we see that.
They accumulate.
Right.
It's not always that big hit that, when you talk in terms of football or hockey, it's not always that big hit. You think about football, linemen banging their heads every single play. Mm-hmm. You think about soccer and heading the ball, and sometimes, in practice, sometimes, dozens or hundreds of times a day in a practice. All those little micro injuries do add up.
Mm-hmm. So whether we're talking about somebody in sports, or I like to say the average Joe or average Josephine, how much omega-3 are we talking? Obviously seafood is a great source, but I'm guessing that we need more than we can get from the diet. So how much are we talking? And what about EPA and DHA? I always get confused about those.
Well, there's a couple of things to consider. So if you live in Japan, and sort of the middle or older age Japan that doesn't eat, American junk food, they generally eat some type of seafood, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I mean, if you've ever spent any time in Japan, they eat a lot of fish. And that's great. So eating fish is the best way. But the problem is, in America, we don't eat a lot of fish. And so unless you're willing to eat fish, even 3-4 times a week, which most Americans aren't, then what's another way to get things going is through supplementation. And it's meant to be just that, a supplement, not a replacement. Mm-hmm. And so we sometimes get confused, and we want to, say this is the answer. No, the answer is eat more fish and less omega-6 type of foods, and less processed foods or more seafood. That's the better answer, because you got to deal with the 6s and the 3s. But when it comes to supplementation, what the FDA tells us, they have a term generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, GRAS. And the GRAS level for omega-3s, according to the U.S. FDA, is 3,000 milligrams of the combined amount of EPA and DHA, some long chemical names for those, but the initials most people know, EPA and DHA. They're the principal long-chain omega-3s. DHA is what we find in the brain. And EPA is kind of more considered sort of the heart healthy one, whereas DHA is more the brain healthy one. But you really need both, because a large amount of our blood flow to our body goes to our brain. So you really can't separate out. People say, well, you only need DHA. Well, no, EPA is really important as well. We don't know the best balance between the two, so I kind of look at nature gives us both, and that's what we should go with. So I kind of look at that 3,000 milligram generally recognized as safe level as, what a daily dose should be, because we're typically very deficient in omega-3s, and you can actually measure that in blood tests as well. So if you want to really get more scientific, more objective about it, get your blood tested, and you can find out what your omega-3 levels are and your omega-6 levels.
Yeah, I'd like to see that become a little bit more mainstream. I actually had that done a couple years ago, I believe. I attended a conference. It was a sponsored conference, and was able to get my omega-3 levels checked. And I'm one of those lucky people who always have a great HDL, a great LDL, good genes, and, decent diet and exercise. But my omega-3s were low, and I did a podcast interview. It was episode 74, Are You Getting Enough Omega-3s, with Ellen Shutt from GoEd. She's the communications director. That's the global organization for EPA and DHA. So people can go and listen to that, because we talk a lot about food sources, supplement resources, and their website, alwaysomega3s.com, kind of like how vitamin D is now more of a routine blood test when you get your annual physical. It'd be great if the omega-3 test would also be more routine.
It would be nice if that were the case. And one of the things to consider is the fact that there's actually really good science out there that show that omega-3 levels are probably a better indicator of heart health than cholesterol.
Right. I mean, I think, as you know, we know we're not getting enough seafood in our diet, so we can probably assume our levels are low. And we know that the minimum recommendation is seafood twice a week, but you mentioned 3 to 4 times a week. And in Japan, 3 times a day, we could emulate that as well. But between what we can realistically get into our diet and adding some supplements, you're looking at that 3,000 milligram amount.
That's my standard go-to dose and
a starting point.
2 to 3,000, but most people are so deficient. I actually, as a clinician, I rarely check people's omega-3 levels because all I have to do is ask them how and what they eat, and I know almost everybody's going to be deficient. So why waste the money on a test when we know what the results are going to be? And it's not going to change what I'm going to do. I'm going to recommend that they get started on 3,000 milligrams a day. But when I am seeing somebody that's struggling with brain health or even mental health issues, I know they're deficient and I want to change that as quickly as possible. So I up that. I use it as a loading dose. So I do 3,000 milligrams actually 3 times a day for a week or two, or if it's more serious, maybe even a month or two, at 9,000 milligrams a day as a loading dose. But, that's something that you shouldn't be on long term. That's, the 2,000-3,000 range is where we should be. So I want to correct that deficiency quickly and then get people down to that.
Like a maintenance dose.
Right. The generally recognized as safe maintenance dose.
Okay, great. What about things like the MIND diet, which is a combination of the Mediterranean DASH diet? We hear about, the acronym MIND, obviously it speaks to brain health. But what about diets like that? I mean, yes, we've already talked about getting more omega-3s in our diet, but speak to that aspect.
So when I have a patient that's coming in and struggling with the issues of a concussion, typically months, very often years actually, I really look at 4 major things. Diet and exercise are the 2 biggest. And you'd be surprised because, you've had a concussion and the doctor or the emergency room or wherever told you, go sit in a dark room for a couple of weeks and you should get better. And then you don't get better. And they say, well, don't do anything. Don't exercise, avoid electronics and, all these things that are actually now being disproven and never were based in science. So, the idea of exercise, get more blood flow to your brain so that it can heal, gets the nutrients and oxygen that it needs, and takes out the trash that it needs to. So exercise is really important and underappreciated, but that's starting to change. That's good. And I talk to them about diet. And if you want to, I'd say it's sort of Mediterranean meets paleo meets keto. And they're sort of in the same area of the spectrum. Keto is maybe the extreme. And so, keto is not a terrible thing. It's actually one way you can sort of shock your system into, utilizing different forms of energy, particularly for the brain. I don't necessarily buy into that keto is the best long-term answer. The only diet that's ever really been shown to be good for cognitive function is the Mediterranean or MIND diet, but and in between there is kind of paleo. So paleo is just really sort of that concept if nature didn't put it here and if man had to process it, it's probably not a good thing. But really that MIND diet, the Mediterranean diet, which is the idea of fruits and vegetables sort of based, and then lean proteins, and principally from seafood if you can. So that's really the only one that's ever been shown to be scientifically proven to be good for cognitive health. And I think that's a good way to go. One of the things I always talk about is cutting out sugars by far. The more you can cut out just all simple sugars, and really the only carbohydrates you should be getting are, again, sort of that paleo kind of concept of if it didn't grow on a tree or in a bush or whatever, it didn't come from nature, you shouldn't eat it. Those are the types, fruits and vegetables should be, and principally vegetables, should really be our main, if not our only source of carbohydrates.
And I will say that the Mind diet does include whole grains, berries, obviously, green leafy vegetables are emphasized in that diet, very much along the lines of the Mediterranean diet. Is there anything else that if someone has had a concussion or had trauma besides these omega-3s, is there anything else that you're looking at that you recommend?
Well, I mentioned that I kind of look at four things, diet and exercise being the two foundational things. And then the third area that I look at is what I would call targeted nutritional supplementation. And omega-3 certainly is the mainstay, in my opinion, for that. That's number one. And then I'll come back to that for a second. And the fourth area, actually, when the brain gets rattled, the pituitary gland is particularly at risk of being affected. And so I generally look at pituitary function or dysfunction, and the downstream effects of that are in our hormones. So, whether it's growth hormone, testosterone, thyroid, estrogen, progesterone, are some of the main hormones that can be looked at and be measured in the blood. So in some cases, those need to be addressed. So back to number 3, targeted nutritional supplementation. Fish oil is number 1. The next one that I really look at that's been profound, that is new to me in just the last 4 or 5 years, is actually CBD or cannabidiol, particularly hemp-derived CBD. And the reason why hemp is because hemp doesn't have the THC like its cousin on the cannabis side, marijuana. So hemp CBD oil has been a really tremendous tool. And when you use hemp and fish oil together, it's really quite a powerful way to help a lot of patients. It may not be right or what helps 100% of patients, because it's not a drug, it's not a cure. We're talking about nutritional foundations to get two things. We want to get the nutritional foundation in place, so if the brain is going to be able to heal, it's got the right foundation to be able to do that. It's got the right substances to help for antioxidants and things like that. But also the brain, it's kind of my brick wall analogy, is if you have a brick wall that gets damaged, wouldn't you want to use bricks to repair that wall? Well, DHA, omega-3s are really kind of like the bricks of the brain or the cell membrane. And so you need those construction materials, those basic construction materials to help the repair process, in addition to dealing with the inflammation and the antioxidant part of it.
Very interesting. Thank you. So I know that your son has played and plays sports. What do you say to parents about their kids participating in sports? Like I said, my son in basketball, broke his nose. It wasn't even football. We talked about kids are at increased risk for concussion, head injuries. We all, as when we're elderly, or I shouldn't say, as we get older, more fall risks, that sort of a thing. But what do you say to parents about their kids participating in sports?
I am a huge believer and a huge advocate for sports and playing outside. I mean, I think one of the saddest things from when I was a kid, you couldn't drag me inside. And now it seems like you can't get kids to go outside. Or we as parents, I don't know where this all changed, but, we've become so paranoid about our kids being outside playing. So a good alternative is organized sports. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's, in many ways, that's one of the most important things we can do for our children. is get them on teams, get them into organized sports, not just for the physical aspect of it, which is hugely important, but also for the learning of life lessons. The idea of being a teammate, to, get knocked down and have to get back up again, and to persevere and learn how to win, how to lose, how to be a good sport, whether you win or lose. And I think those are life lessons that are best learned on the playing field as we're growing up. And it doesn't matter what the sport is, whether it's basketball or football or hockey or rugby or whatever. I think that being a member socially and all of the aspects of it, leadership-wise, it's really important. You don't learn these lessons sitting on the couch playing Xbox, and you certainly don't get the exercise sitting on the couch playing Xbox. So I'm a huge advocate. In fact, I'm one of the founding members of the Pop Warner Youth Football Medical Advisory Board, because I'm such a believer in team sports. But on the other hand, there are ways we can make all sports safer, not just equipment, not just rules and rules enforcement, but also what's never really talked about. You hear about a better helmet in football and, targeting calls and things like that. And I think some of the things that we're doing now, like no checking in hockey below a certain age, no heading in soccer below a certain age, decreasing or eliminating tackling in practice for football. Those are things that I think are really important. But what nobody's talking about is how do we make the brain safer from the inside out? And really, in my mind, there's only one way to do that, and that's with nutrition.
Wow. Well, I couldn't agree more about all of the life lessons that come from sports. I've seen it directly with my kids. I grew up doing ballet, so it wasn't team sports, and I learned some other life lessons in that environment, but nonetheless, it was...
Well, you mentioned my son. I mean, he was all-county, leading rusher on, running back on the football team, and now he's in college playing rugby. His older sister, my daughter, was a ballet dancer and actually is finishing up college, getting a degree in dance. Wow. And it is a bit of a team sport, actually, when you get to the point of, choreography and everything else. But it's talk about, athleticism and perseverance and discipline. Ballet is fantastic. Just like, karate and some of the, taekwondo are also great sports, and they may not necessarily be looked at as team sports, but it does take perseverance and it does take discipline for those sports.
Yes, and I'll add a lot of brain work, because
absolutely
knowing the combinations, reversing the combinations, it's so good for your brain. So good. I went back to it, obviously, for the body. I took a 25-year hiatus, but I've been back to it for about 5 years and just really enjoying. And likewise with karate, there's more of a mind-body sort of connection going on there. So
absolutely.
Well, tell us about your book. And your website is brainhealtheducation.org, and your book is When Brains Collide. Tell us a little bit about that, what people can find on your site, and what people can find in your book.
So brainhealtheducation.org, it's the website of the small nonprofit that I started when I retired from the Army. And it's, I think, a really good resource of information, where I think probably one of the best things that I do there is I've got a latest news section as well as a newsletter I try to put out. I used to do it weekly, but I've gotten so busy that I try to get it out monthly now. But the latest news section is I'm constantly getting feeds from the news sources on what's going on in the science. And, I'm always looking at traumatic brain injury and concussions and Omega-3s and CBD and scanning what's the latest scientific news in those areas. And I post them up on the website and try to also get it out on the Facebook when there's really, I think, important studies that show up into the scientific news. So I put those out through brainhealtheducation.org. And like I said, if you want a little bit more of a push, you can sign up for the newsletter. And When Brains Collide is finally, I kept getting asked, when are you going to write a book about all this?
Mm-hmm.
So just actually 3 years ago this month, I published When Brains Collide, and that's available principally through Amazon, some of the other online retailers. But you can go to Amazon.com and get When Brains Collide. And it really does it was like a download of the information. And so I combine it with not just the information about why omega-3s and brain health, not just for prevention, but for after a concussion occurs. And whether it's concussion or even I got a section on severe traumatic brain injury, but I also temper it with stories because people, I think, really relate to stories. And I will say the target audience, it's not a textbook. It's really my target audience for When Brains Collide is moms, literally, the soccer moms out there, right, who have a 15-year-old high school girl playing soccer, or the 15-year-old who wants to play ice hockey, or the 17-year-old high school senior playing football. Moms can change the world, and moms set the tone for most of the family. So that's who the audience really is for When Brains Collide.
Excellent. I'll put all the links to all of these resources in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. It sounds like a great resource. And yeah, we love stories. And yeah, moms can change the world. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Michael Lewis, for being on the show and sharing all this important information with us and for all the wonderful work that you're doing.
It's a pleasure. And I know you've got a great audience out there, and hopefully they will continue to spread the word, and together we can all change the world.
Absolutely. Starting with Dr. Michael Lewis and now the moms and all of us. So thank you so much. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
Hey, if you like what you're hearing on the show, please share it with others. You can also make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast in whatever app you use to listen, or subscribe to my newsletter and e-blasts to get notifications about new episodes. Just go onto my website at soundbitesrd.com and you'll see the newsletter sign up on the podcast episodes page. And while you're there, you can get any of my free downloadables, like my Do More with Dinner resource kit, my Sound Science Toolkit, or my best podcast resources. If you want to share an episode on social media or leave a review on iTunes, that would be great too. I'm always adding reviews and testimonials to my website as well. So send me an email at melissa@soundbitesrd.com with any feedback that you want to share. Thank you so much.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke.